Aloha Ukulele Club of Hawaii members. It is me, Sarah Maisel, one of the founders of 4 Strings at a Time, and I'm very excited about today's lesson. Something that I really enjoyed about our meeting in April was that I got to go around and see everybody playing and watch people make their chord changes, and it gave me the idea for this lesson. So what we're going to do is we're going to do some simplified chords. Now, sometimes chords might have a crazy fancy name, but they're actually easier to play than the standard chord. And I'm going to show you guys some examples of that. And I'm also going to showcase some of those examples in the songs that are going to be in this month's packet. So just don't worry about, names of stuff. I'm going to call out names. Names will be listed and things like that in your handout. So make sure you have your handout handy with you. And remember, this video, the handout, everything's totally free. So just make sure to have it with you as I go through. One of the first things that you can always try out is anytime there's a major chord listed, sometimes the major 6 chord is easier to play. There is no greater example than B flat. Who doesn't love B flat, right? So your B flat chord that you typically hold is going to be 3, 2, 1, and 1, right? So what we're going to do is you're just going to remove your ring finger and have an open G string. So you're holding open, 2, 1, and 1. This is a B flat major 6 chord. It's also sometimes just called B flat 6. This chord is in many ways much easier than adding that ring finger. And just listen to the 2 and see if you can really hear a big difference with my high G ukulele. So B flat 6. B flat 6. It's not a huge difference. If you play low G, however, you will hear a bit more of a difference just because that G string is an octave lower, but it still works just fine. So anytime there's a B flat in a song, and let's say you can get down these 2 fingers on that C string and the E and the A string, you don't really need your ring finger to come and join if you don't want it to. So anytime there's a B flat chord, play B flat 6. It's a little bit easier to do. Another example I have on this first page is a G chord. Now G isn't really super hard, but let's say you're arthritic and you have a really tough time, adding in this ring finger here. Or let's say this finger is very stiff and it doesn't allow you to even bring in that ring finger to hold your standard G chord. You don't really need this one. You can have an open E string and you're holding open 2, open 2. It sounds lovely. G6 chord. I'm going to put my ring finger down. Here's G. G6 chord. G. You can hear a difference, but it's not too bad. And you could totally play this chord instead of a G chord, and no one will know, okay? So it works lovely. And the great thing about this is if your neighbor is playing a regular G chord and you're playing the G6 together, you're actually making something really beautiful and adding in that little bit of color. So these are all chords that you can play at the jam, and no one's going to give you stink eye because you're going to sound great with the rest of the group. Our next example is C major. Let's take a look at that. Granted, C is not really that hard of a chord, just holding open, 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 and 3, right? But you could play a C6, which is even easier because it's all open strings, right? Open, 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 open. So you have a C chord you can play, or you can play C6, or C, or C6, right? Those will sound great together. So your neighbor can play C, you can play C6. It will sound lovely. If you're at a jam and the song's in the key of C and you don't know where you are, you can always kind of jam on this until C comes around, and then you can, hop back on the train, as they say. So, just food for thought. So those 3 chords that I've listed, that B flat versus B flat 6, G versus G6, and the C versus C6, those are all going to be found in our songs. So you can absolutely go in and write little notes to yourself if we haven't already written them in the music, and, remind yourself, oh, I could play this instead, and try it out. This next chord I just threw in because it's one that we do get asked about frequently, and that's an E flat or E. The same principle applies to both, and I'll show that. So the standard E flat is typically going to be 3, 3, 3, 1. Now this shape is one that a lot of people tend to have trouble with. They forget that it should kind of come from a D. And notice how my fingers are actually at a diagonal here within the fret itself, right? And if I was to take my index and just go boop and put it right here above the nut on my A string, and if I was to take this and just scoot it up, whoop, there's my E flat. So I was here, D, and I scooted up, and I scoot it up again, there's my E. The main thing to keep in mind is a lot of people, when they build this chord, they start with the index and then put these guys down. And then you don't think much about like where these guys are going. So I like to build it where you actually start with the 3 fingers, making sure you've got a nice diagonal happening within the fret itself, and then you add your index to the party. I find it to be easier to think of it as D first, and then moving it up. Eventually, you'll work around to getting 3 down and then adding the index, and then eventually it's all gonna become one move, right? But just food for thought. Now, you could just skip that entirely and just play a major 6 chord. And in this case, for our E flat, an E flat 6 chord is me just on that 3rd fret, barring everything, right? Super easy, just bar the 3rd fret. So the finger, the fret where everyone was squished, just bar it. That also works for your E chord. I'm holding, what is this? 4, 4, 4, 2, and I could just bar the 4th fret. And now I have an E6 chord. Totally works, usually sounds good. Sometimes you might prefer the sound of the original. And a lot of that has to do with what's happening in the melody and stuff. Just use your ear and trust your gut. If your neighbor's playing, an E flat, try E flat 6 and see how it sounds, because together you, again, are adding more harmony and you're making a larger chord together. Okay, so that's anytime you see a major chord, try out a major 6 if you'd like. Sometimes it's easier than its standard major counterpart. Next, we're going to look at your minor chords. So instead of playing a regular minor chord, try out a minor 7. So my first example here, I have a B flat minor chord, right? So that's me holding 3, 1, 1, 1. A lot of times people have trouble playing this chord, particularly because when they bring this ring finger over, this finger wants to try to bend as well. And you want to try to keep this finger flat so that, again, it is barring these 3, okay? Sometimes you could shift your finger and you could just make it so you're only covering 3 strings. For me, it's easier to have the bar just go all the way across behind that. But you could forego the ring finger entirely and just bar the 1st fret, and that's a B minor 7. And it's a B flat minor 7, excuse me. Sounds great, and sounds great with your neighbor. Now I have another chord listed. It's a B flat minor 6, and you'll notice there's an asterisk there. And it says this chord, a minor 6 chord, might not always sound good with your neighbor. So use your ear and your own discretion. However, I like pointing out this one because in this particular instance, B flat minor 6 sounds awesome and is even easier because you're only barring 3 strings. So you have open 1, 1, 1. And I love it. That minor 6 has a little extra spooky sound to it. That's really beautiful. So let's just go through so you can hear B flat minor, B flat minor 7, and then B flat 6, or B flat minor 6. All really lovely sounds, all very minory and sad. All of those are great things for your B flat minor chord. So you could try B flat minor 7, will always sound good with the neighbor. You could try a B flat minor 6, might not sound good with your neighbor, but try and see. You might find that it works just fine for the particular song you're playing. The next one that I have is E minor. So we've had many folks say, oh, I have so much trouble, with E minor. Well, you could play E minor 7. E minor 7 is just open 2, open 2. We've played this shape before. In fact, if you just look up at the piece of paper and look at G and you look at a G6, what's the difference between a G6 and an E minor 7? Nothing, just the name, right? So take a moment to calm yourself, because you're going to go, but why? How? So when we get into some of these more colorful chords, you're going to discover some chords that look alike but have different names. At first, it's exciting because you're like, oh, that's less I have to memorize. But then you'll get frustrated because you're like, well, why can't we just call it X? It has to do with the key the song is in and the context of the chord. What comes before and after it, that's going to tell you the chord's real name. If you're playing with another ukulele player, you really do not need to worry about what its real name is, because you can just tell them, oh, just play this. Play what looks like G6. Play what looks like X, Y, or Z. We'll be able to follow. It won't be a problem. However, if you're playing with a bass player or another chord-based instrument like a guitar player, you're going to want to tell them what you're really doing. That's when it's going to be important, when you're involving other instruments into your jam. So just food for thought on that. But I'm just going to keep moving on. So instead of E minor here, you could play E minor. Open 2, open 2. Now, one thing I want to point out is there are some songs where you go from a G to an E minor. One thing that you can try that's not written down, so take some notes, is I've got my G chord. I could actually take my pinky, if it'll listen to me, and put it boop, 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 right there on the 4th fret of my C string. That's instantly E minor. Do you see that? It's also a great exercise to make your pinky listen. So that's, if you know you're going from G to E minor, try doing the pinky trick, because you're just adding one finger and that's it. Again, if say you have arthritis and you're like, yeah, that ain't happening, Sarah, no problem. G chord, lift up a finger. G, E minor 7 in this case. G, E minor 7. You can absolutely do that, and it will work out just fine in your jam. And it will sound lovely with your neighbor, okay? So there's those, and then there's one more minor example that I'm giving, and that is A minor. Now, A minor is a very easy chord. It's just 2 open, open, open. However, you could play A minor 7, which is all open strings. So you have A minor, A minor 7. And here we have another look-alike. C6 and A minor 7 look exactly the same. Crazy, right? Yeah. So the thing that I'm going to just point out right now, for those of you that want a little theoretical stuff to think about, is that what relationship does C major have to A minor? Or even G major to E minor? Well, it's the C is the relative major to A minor, and vice versa. A minor is the relative minor to C major. What that basically means is that a C major scale has no sharps or flats, right? Generally starts on C, right? That. An A minor scale has no sharps or flats. It shares the exact same scale notes as your C major, but it starts on an A note instead, okay? So if I was to go just up my A string and do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. That sounded really minory, didn't it? And no sharps or flats, and I just started my scale in a different place. That's one potential reason why your chords might look alike. They're probably related to each other in some manner. So I don't want to delve too far deep into that, because that's for a whole other lesson. But just something to consider is when you find chords that do look alike, you might want to think, how are those chords related to each other? But again, that's for another lesson. Let's move on to some other substitutions that you can totally try out in our jam. So I call these other substitutions to try because there's a a variety of reasons why these work, and I'll kind of go through it on a case-by-case basis. The very first one I love to point out is instead of F, you can play F add 9, and no one will know, especially if you're playing high G. So your regular F chord is 2, open, 1, and open, right? Well, you don't really need that middle finger. You can play an open G string, and you have open, open, 1, open. So if I was to strum F, now here's my F add 9. F, F add 9. It's not really a huge difference. It's one less finger, and especially if you are a beginner, just using this for your F chord makes things go so much easier for you. I actually prefer the sound of an F add 9. I think it's just a gorgeous open sound that I tend to just not play F as much because I just prefer it, okay? Another one that I want you to keep in mind and think about that you will find when we meet together for our jam is B7. Standard B7, you're going to bar that second fret, and you're going to hold 2, 3, 2, 2. This sounds great. It's a lovely chord, but let's say you have hand issues, and you're like, yeah, that bar chord ain't happening. Well, you could very easily just hold this chord, which has an open A string happening in it. So you're holding 4, 3, 2, open. And you can play that for your B7. One thing I want to point out is there's 2 songs in this packet where we go from an E minor to a B7. And if you play your standard E minor, open 4, 3, 2, all you have to do is take the same shape and just scoot over a set of strings. And there's B7. So again, you have E minor. Let's try it together. E minor, 2, 3, move it over, B7, 2, 3, back to E minor, and go back to B7, and go back to E minor, and go back to B. And we'll end on E minor. There. You could do that, or you could do the bar. Doesn't matter to us, but just showing you that there could potentially be an easier way if that helped you. Looking at the next one, we have 2 versions of C. Now, this one probably will seem somewhat obvious if you are looking back up at that B flat 6 chord. So if I was to hold the next position of C, it should remind you of B flat, but it's up a couple of frets. So I'm actually holding 5, 4, 3, 3. This is another version of C. Remember that C? It sounds pretty much the same, right? But you could take away your ring finger and have the open G string, because a G note exists in our C chord already. It's actually the same note that's on the 3rd fret of our E string. And there you go. Here's another C you could play. The reason I bring up this C is there's a song in our packet where we're playing F, B flat, and C7. F, B flat, C7, right? I could do this instead. I'm going to play F add 9, B flat 6, and I'm going to move this up to the 3rd fret. So I'm actually, instead of playing C7, I'm being sneaky. I'm playing a regular C chord. FYI, that's going to sound good if your neighbor plays C7. So don't worry about it. You're sharing 3 of the same notes. So you could totally do that. So again, F add 9, B flat, move it up. And then I've got B flat 6 to the C. Move it up. Back to the F add 9. Last time, B flat, C, and then my F, or F add 9. Yeah. Again, something fun that you can practice anytime you notice that sequence. Even if the sequence says C7, you can play that C and it'll still sound great. So let's keep moving on. The next one is an E flat 7. Now, this is not found in our songs, but I just like to point it out because it's one that some people might come up against. And so E flat 7, the best place you can play it on your ukulele is what I have written there. So you're barring the 3rd fret. So I've got 3, 3, 3, and 4. And sometimes that's kind of a pain to get to, especially if you're down here doing sort of single notes. But if you want to keep it down in the 1st fret area, you can play an E flat 9, and no one will know. It's open 1, 1, 1. Now this as a look-alike chord. You'll be like, wait, wasn't that a B flat minor 6? Yes, it was. In that context, remember, the name of the chord happens because of the key you're in and the context of the chord, what comes before and after it, okay? In this context, you can replace E flat 7 with an E flat 9 down here, and no one will be the wiser, okay? Moving on to E flat. E flat, I did show you. Yeah, you could play E flat 6, but an E flat chord has a G note in it, so you could just have an open G string. So I'm holding my standard, so E flat, and I could just take away, and I've got that, open 3, 3, 1. Now typically I don't play it with my ring and my pinky. I tend to play it with these 2 fingers. So I'm holding my middle and my ring next to each other on the 2 center strings, the C string and the E string. So I'm playing open 3, 3, 1. That's just a regular E flat chord with 2 G's happening in it, okay? When I'm playing this one, I have 2 B flat notes happening. So I'm just replacing what's being doubled. And it just happens that I have that lovely open high G string that sounds fantastic. It also works with low G as well, but it might sound a little bit more boomy just because the G string is lower. So just keep that in mind. So as you look through our music sheets, one thing to look at, and we did try to put in a few spots, like for example, Hene Hene Ko Aka. We're going to do that song again, but in a new key. I'm making us do it in the key of F. And that's on page 3. And one thing to think about, and we wrote it in, is chords you can try during the jam. Instead of F, you can try playing that F add 9. Play that B flat instead. F7 is one that you could just play F and no one will know because again, dominant 7 chords like F7 share 3 of the same notes that you find in a major chord. So you actually could skip adding that note and no one's going to notice, especially if your neighbor's playing the F7. So just food for thought, because sometimes going here and adding the rest. But you could also, before we get to club, make that part of your practice. 1, 2, 3, 4. Add 2, 3. Take away 1, 2, 3, and add. Or hold a regular F and do the same thing. Add 2 friends. Take away 2 friends. So again, all things to think about, but look through the packet, make your own notes if you want to try out chords that we might not have listed. And also for those of you that are feeling very ambitious and can already play most of these chords in your first position, start writing in some second position chords for yourself so that you can play further up the neck. And again, enhance the sound of the group and the jam. I hope you enjoyed some of these really fun, I like to call them cheater chords, but just simplifying things a little bit so that the chords are maybe a little bit more accessible for you and just help enhance the sound of our group. We are really excited to see you guys on May 18th. It will be live streamed and the live stream will be recorded so you can enjoy it over and over again. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you at club.